Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. The historical trends, case studies, and potential outcomes discussed are based on archival data and sociological research from the 1970s. Divorce laws and family court procedures vary significantly by jurisdiction and have evolved considerably since the era discussed. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding their specific legal or personal situations. In 1974, for the first time in the history of the United States, more American marriages ended in a courtroom than at a graveside. This was the year the statistics flipped, signaling a tectonic shift in the American nuclear family that no one was truly prepared for. Imagine being a father in 1972. You grew up in the shadow of the greatest generation, where the suburban home with the white picket fence wasn't just a dream, it was the expected baseline. Then, almost overnight, the legal and social ground beneath you liquidated. You found yourself standing in a wood-paneled, one-bedroom apartment, staring at a calendar where your children's names were circled only 2 weekends a month. You weren't just a father anymore, you were a visitor. This deep dive is going to uncover the brutal reality of the 1970s divorce revolution, an era often romanticized for its music and fashion, but one that functioned as a meat grinder for the American father. By examining the historical trends of this decade, we are going to solve a major problem facing men today: the mystery of why our modern family court system feels so adversarial. To understand the why of today's custody battles, child support structures, and the psychological lingering of the disposable parent myth, we have to go back to the decade where the rules were rewritten in real time. We are going to look at the case studies of the men who lived through the no-fault explosion, the transition from the tender years doctrine to the best interests of the child standard, and the birth of the father's rights movement. To truly grasp the gravity of the 1970s, we have to look at the legal earthquake known as no-fault divorce. Before 1970, if a man wanted a divorce, or if his wife wanted one, they generally had to prove fault. This meant providing evidence of adultery, extreme cruelty, or abandonment. It was a high bar that often forced couples to stay together or engage in elaborate, staged charades to satisfy the court. But in 1969, Governor Ronald Reagan signed California's Family Law Act, which took effect on January 1, 1970. This was the first no-fault divorce law in the country. It eliminated the need for a guilty party. Suddenly, a marriage could be dissolved based simply on irreconcilable differences. The potential outcomes of this legislative shift were immediate and massive. Within just a few years, almost every state in the Union followed suit. The divorce rate, which had been relatively stable for decades, began a vertical climb. For the American father of the 70s, this meant that the stability of his home life was no longer protected by the high walls of fault litigation. If the marriage wasn't working, it was over, and the legal system was suddenly flooded with millions of cases it was not equipped to handle. During this period, the judicial system relied heavily on a legal principle known as the tender years doctrine. This was a 19th century judicial presumption that during a child's tender years, generally regarded as age 7 and under, the mother was the uniquely qualified caregiver. In the 1970s, even as women were entering the workforce in record numbers, and the feminist movement was challenging traditional gender roles, the family courts remained frozen in this Victorian mindset. When the no-fault wave hit, the default setting for judges was to award sole physical custody to the mother. For the father, the step-by-step reality of a 1970s divorce usually looked like this. First, he would be moved out of the family home, often via a temporary restraining order or a simple judicial decree to maintain the peace. Second, he would be granted visitation, a word that many men of the era began to loathe because it categorized them with hospital guests rather than parents. The standard schedule was the 1-4-7-10 model, the first and third weekends of the month, sometimes with a Wednesday night dinner if the parents lived close enough. Consider the case study of a typical middle-class father in 1975. He worked 40 to 50 hours a week at a manufacturing plant or a corporate office. His identity was tied to being the provider. When the divorce papers were served, he didn't just lose his spouse, he lost his primary social role. The 1970s was the me decade, a term coined by writer Tom Wolfe to describe a shift away from communal responsibility toward individual self-actualization. As parents sought their own happiness and finding themselves, the children and the fathers often found themselves in a state of suspension. The psychological impact of this era cannot be overstated. Researchers like Judith Wallerstein began long-term studies in the early 1970s, specifically the Marin County Project, which tracked children of divorce. What these studies eventually revealed was a generation of weekend dads who felt alienated from their children's daily lives. These men weren't there for the scraped knees, the homework struggles, or the quiet breakfast conversations. They were relegated to Disney dad status, forced to pack 2 weeks of parenting into 48 hours of entertainment. This created a profound sense of grief and inadequacy. Economically, the 1970s were also a period of stagflation, high inflation and stagnant economic growth. For a divorced father, this was a pincer movement. He was often ordered to pay child support and alimony based on his peak earning years, even as the cost of living skyrocketed and his own living expenses doubled because he was now maintaining a second household. The 1970s saw the first real crackdown on what the media began to call deadbeat dads. While there were certainly men who abandoned their responsibilities, the broad brush application of this label often ignored the millions of men who were struggling to stay afloat while being legally barred from seeing their children. By 1976, a counter-movement began to stir. This was the beginning of the father's rights movement in the U.S. Men began to organize in small groups in cities like Los Angeles and New York, realizing that the best interests of the child standard, which was starting to replace the tender years doctrine, was being applied inconsistently. They argued that it was in a child's best interest to have 2 active parents, not 1 parent and 1 visitor. This was the era where the term joint custody first entered the mainstream lexicon, spearheaded by advocates like James Cook. As we look back at this decade, we see the blueprint for the modern American family. The 1970s were the laboratory where the current formulas for child support and the structures of custody were first tested. Many of the frustrations men feel in the family court system today are not new. They are the legacy of a system that was built in a hurry to respond to a social revolution it didn't understand. By the end of this deep dive series, you will understand exactly how these historical trends shape the legal landscape you navigate today. We are going to break down the legislative battles of the late 70s, the rise of the social sciences in the courtroom, and how the lonely 70s dad eventually paved the way for the involved co-parent of the 21st century. But to get there, we must first look closer at the specific cultural images that define the 1970s divorced father, from the depiction of Kramer versus Kramer to the reality of the wood-paneled bachelor pad that became a symbol of a generation of displaced men. This isn't just history. It's the origin story of the modern American father. To understand the 1970s divorced dad, you have to understand the physical space he was forced to inhabit. Imagine if you were Mike, a 34-year-old account manager in 1976 Chicago. On Friday afternoon, you were a husband and a father of 2 living in a split-level home in the suburbs. By Monday morning, you were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex specifically marketed to singles. This was the era of the singles complex, a social experiment in high-density living that became the accidental dumping ground for a generation of displaced fathers. These complexes were often built with thin walls, shag carpeting and communal pools that promised a lifestyle of liberation. But for the divorced man, they were often sites of profound domestic illiteracy. Historical trends during this period show a massive surge in the construction of these multifamily units in Sunbelt cities like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Houston. For the 1970s father, the move was a step-by-step descent into a lifestyle he had never been trained for. In 1976, most men of Mike's generation had moved directly from their mother's house to a college dorm, and then to a home managed by their wife. They often did not know how to cook a meal that didn't involve a can opener, how to operate a washing machine without shrinking their wool suits, or how to decorate a space to make it feel like a home for children. This resulted in the iconic bleak bachelor pad of the mid-70s, a beanbag chair, a folding card table, a stereo system that cost more than the rest of the furniture combined, and a refrigerator containing nothing but beer, mustard, and a half-eaten deli sandwich. This lack of domesticity had a direct impact on the potential outcomes of custody hearings. When a social worker or a guardian ad litem performed a home visit in 1977, they weren't looking for a loving connection. They were looking for a nursery. If a father's apartment lacked a dedicated bedroom for the child or if the pantry was empty, it was used as categorical evidence that he was unfit for anything more than standard visitation. This created a high-stakes economic trap. To win more time with his children, a father needed a larger, more expensive apartment, but the financial strain of the divorce often made that impossible. The economic landscape of the mid-1970s was a nightmare for a single-income earner trying to support two households. Looking back from 2026, we often forget that the 1970s was defined by stagflation, a brutal combination of stagnant economic growth and runaway inflation. Between 1973 and 1975, the cost of living in the United States increased by nearly 30%. For a divorced father, this meant that the child support amount set by a judge in 1972 was often worth significantly less by 1975, leading to constant legal friction and the emergence of the deadbeat narrative in popular media. Case studies from the era show that even men who were working 60 hours a week often found themselves living below the poverty line after paying their court-ordered obligations and their own rent. This financial and social displacement was perfectly captured and then radically shifted by a single cultural event: the 1979 release of the film Kramer vs. Kramer. Before this movie hit theaters, the American public generally viewed the divorced father through two lenses. He was either the swing-in bachelor who had abandoned his family for a younger woman, or he was the invisible provider who sent a check but never showed up. Kramer vs. Kramer, starring Dustin Hoffman, offered a third archetype: the father who learns to parent out of necessity and finds that he is actually good at it. The film serves as a masterclass in the 1970s transition of fatherhood. We see Hoffman's character, Ted Kramer, go through the step-by-step process of domesticating himself. The famous French toast scene is not just about cooking. It is a metaphor for the messy, painful, and ultimately rewarding process of a father claiming his right to nurture. In 1979, audiences watched Ted Kramer navigate the same visitation hurdles that millions of real-world men were facing. They saw him lose his job because he had to take his son to the hospital, a reality that many employers of the era found unacceptable for a male employee. The film didn't just reflect reality. It began to change it by humanizing the struggle of the single father in the eyes of the American public, and more importantly, in the eyes of the judiciary. However, the reality on the ground remained far more adversarial than the Hollywood ending. In 1978, the typical legal battle for a father was still an uphill climb against a system that viewed him as a secondary parent. Let's look at a case study of a man we will call David, living in New Jersey in 1974. David was a schoolteacher who wanted 50-50 custody of his 3-year-old daughter. At the time, this was considered a radical, almost delusional request. The prevailing psychological theory was the continuous care model, which argued that any disruption in the primary bond with the mother would cause permanent psychological damage to the child. David was told by his own attorney that asking for joint custody would make him look unstable to the judge. He was advised to settle for the standard every other weekend schedule to avoid looking like a troublemaker. This era also saw the birth of the weekend warrior ritual. Every Friday at 6 p.m., a massive silent migration occurred across the American suburbs. Men in sedans and station wagons pulled up to curbs, waited for their children to be brought out, and then drove to their apartments or, in many cases, to cheap motels or the homes of their own parents. Because their apartments were often unsuitable for children, the 1970s dad became the architect of the outing. They spent their entire weekend at the mall, at the cinema, or at parks trying to fill the hours with activity because they lacked a domestic base. This created a specific type of emotional exhaustion. By Sunday night, both the father and the children were spent, having spent 48 hours in a high-pressure performance of fun, rather than the quiet, mundane reality of daily life. Imagine if you were a child during this time. Your father's apartment was a strange, transient place. It smelled of tobacco and old upholstery. No toys there, so you had to bring a suitcase of your life back and forth. You watched your father struggle with tasks your mother used to handle, like braiding hair or making a school lunch. For many men, this was a period of intense, forced growth. They were the first generation of American men who had to learn how to be both the breadwinner and the nurturer simultaneously, without any role models to guide them. As the decade drew to a close, the frustration of these men began to boil over into organized action. They were tired of being visitors in their children's lives. They were tired of a legal system that treated them like an ATM with a limited visitation pass. They began to realize that the no-fault revolution had solved the problem of getting out of a marriage, but it had created a catastrophic new problem regarding what happened after. While these fathers were trying to figure out how to cook French toast and keep their apartments clean, a new kind of legal war was being declared. The 1970s had stripped away the old rules, but it hadn't yet written the new ones. This led to a period of intense legal volatility where fathers started to realize that if the law wouldn't give them their children, they would have to change the law itself. But as they prepared for this fight, a new and terrifying trend was emerging, one that would threaten to push the American father even further out of the picture. In the next part, we are going to look at the rise of the parental alienation phenomenon and the high-stakes legislative battles of 1979 that paved the way for the joint custody laws we take for granted today. We will examine how the me decade eventually collided with the best interests of the child standard, and why some men decided that the only way to be a father was to become a legal insurgent. Stay tuned, because the transition from the visitor to the co-parent was anything but peaceful. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Day in 1977, the American legal system was struggling to catch up with the social reality it had inadvertently created. The shift from the tender years doctrine to the best interests of the child standard was supposed to be a victory for gender neutrality. On paper, it meant that judges were no longer legally bound to give mothers preference based solely on biology. In practice, however, this new standard became a subjective minefield. Without clear guidelines on what constituted a child's best interest, judges in the late 1970s relied on their own outdated biases, often viewing a father's desire for equal custody not as a sign of love, but as a sign of aggression or a tactic to lower child support payments. To understand how this played out, let us look at a case study of a man named Robert, a 38-year-old aerospace technician in Ohio in 1977. Robert represented the typical 1970s father caught in the transition. He had been an involved parent, coaching his son's little league team and helping his daughter with her science fair projects. But when his marriage dissolved under the new no-fault laws, he was shocked to find that his prior involvement carried almost no weight in court. The historical trends of this era show that the best interests of the child standard was frequently interpreted as the primary caretaker standard. Since Robert worked a standard 40-hour week and his wife had been a homemaker, the court viewed her as the only stable anchor for the children. Imagine if you were Robert in 1977. You go to your attorney, hoping to secure at least 3 nights a week with your kids. Your attorney, a man who has seen 1,000 such cases, leans back in his leather chair and tells you that if you push for more than every other weekend, the judge will likely see you as difficult. He explains that the potential outcomes of a contested custody battle include you losing even the small amount of time you currently have. This was the era of the legal chill, where fathers were systematically discouraged from seeking equal time because the judicial climate was so heavily weighted toward the maternal primary model. This environment gave rise to a phenomenon that would not be formally named for another decade, but was being lived by millions of men in the 1970s. The systematic erosion of the father-child bond, often facilitated by the primary custody parent. Today, in 2026, we have a deep understanding of parental gatekeeping and alienation, but in 1977, fathers like Robert were experiencing it without a vocabulary to describe it. Robert would show up at 6 p.m. on a Friday, only to be told the children were sick, or had a birthday party, or simply didn't want to see him. When he turned to the police, he was told it was a civil matter. When he turned to the courts, he was told to be more flexible. Step by step, Robert was being pushed out of his role, not by his own choice, but by a system that provided no enforcement for his visitation rights. The data from 1978 and 1979 reveals a staggering escalation in this crisis. The divorce rate peaked in 1979 at approximately 5.3 per 1,000 people. This meant that over 1.1 million divorces were finalized in a single year, involving hundreds of thousands of children. The sheer volume of cases meant that judges were spending an average of less than 10 minutes on custody decisions. They were using cookie-cutter orders because the system was redlining. For the American father, this meant his relationship with his children was being decided by a person who barely knew their names, based on a social philosophy that was already 10 years out of date. This was the catalyst for the rise of the legal insurgent. Fathers across the United States began to realize that the traditional legal path was a dead end. They started doing something that was almost unheard of in the early 70s. They began representing themselves, or pro se. They flocked to public libraries, spending their weekends not with their children, but huddled over law books, searching for any precedent that could help them stay in their children's lives. They were looking for a way to challenge the visitor status that had been forced upon them. Consider the imagine if scenario of the 1978 communication barrier. There were no cell phones, no FaceTime, and no email. If a father wanted to talk to his child on an off week, he had to call the house where his ex-wife lived. If she didn't pick up, or if she told him the child was busy, that was the end of the interaction. This created a profound sense of helplessness. Case studies from the late 70s describe men who would drive to their children's schools just to catch a glimpse of them on the playground, a practice that often led to them being labeled as harassers or unstable by the courts. The psychological toll of this forced distance was creating a secondary epidemic of depression and substance abuse among divorced men, which further fueled the narrative that they were unfit parents. By 1979, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. The father's rights movement, which had started as a few scattered support groups, was becoming a political force. They began to target the very core of the problem, the lack of a legal presumption for joint custody. They argued that the best interests of the child should naturally include the right to have both parents present. They were fighting against the Solomonic approach of the courts, which seemed more interested in splitting the child's time like a piece of property rather than preserving a relationship. This period saw the introduction of the first joint custody bills in state legislatures. The historical trends show a massive pushback from some segments of the legal and psychological communities who believed that joint custody would be a logistical nightmare for children. They argued that children needed one home and one psychological parent. But the fathers of the late 70s were armed with new research, including early findings from James Cook and others, which suggested that children in joint custody arrangements actually fared better emotionally and academically. The 1970s was a decade of lost fathers, but it was also the decade where those fathers found their voice. They were the ones who had to navigate the transition from the old world expectations of the head of the household to the new world reality of the discarded visitor. Every time a 2026 father walks into a courtroom today with a 50-50 custody presumption, he is standing on the shoulders of the men from 1978 who were ridiculed for wanting to change a diaper or attend a PDA meeting. But as these men began to gain ground legally, a new shadow was falling over the movement. While some fathers were fighting for their rights, others were becoming casualties of a burgeoning industry that saw profit in parental conflict. The late 70s marked the beginning of high-conflict litigation as a business model, where the adversarial nature of the court was used to drain the resources of the very families it was supposed to protect. We are about to enter the final year of the decade 1979, where a specific legislative battle in California would change everything. It was a year where the no-fault revolution finally met its match in a movement that demanded accountability and equal participation. But before we get to the victory of joint custody, we have to look at the darker side of the late 70s, the emergence of child snatching as a desperate response to a broken system. In the next part, we will dive into the harrowing stories of men who felt they had no choice but to take the law into their own hands, and how these desperate acts led to the federal laws that govern parental kidnapping today. The fight for fatherhood was about to get much more dangerous. To understand why the late 1970s became the era of the legal insurgent, you have to understand the sheer lawlessness of the American interstate system regarding custody. In 1978, if a father felt the system had systematically erased him, he discovered a terrifying legal loophole: state lines. Before the federal government stepped in, a custody order issued in Michigan was often treated as a mere suggestion in Texas or Florida. This created a period of historical trends that sociologists now refer to as the child snatching epidemic. For many fathers, the potential outcomes of staying in the system felt like a slow-motion execution of their parenthood, leading them to choose a radical, high-stakes alternative. Imagine if you were Gary, a 31-year-old tool and die maker in Detroit in 1978. Gary had been through the standard 1970s divorce ringer. He had the wood-paneled apartment, the every other weekend visitation, and a growing stack of legal bills that yielded zero results. When his ex-wife informed him she was moving their 6-year-old son to a different time zone to start a new life, Gary went to his attorney. The attorney gave him the grim reality of the era. There was very little the Michigan courts could do to stop a custodial parent from relocating. In Gary's mind, he wasn't just losing a weekend, he was losing his son forever. On a humid Tuesday in July, Gary picked up his son for what was supposed to be a trip to the zoo. Instead, Gary packed a suitcase, emptied his savings account in cash, and steered his 1978 Chevy Nova onto the interstate heading south. In 2026, we live in a world of digital footprints, Amber Alerts, and interconnected police databases. But for Gary in 1978, once he crossed the state line, he essentially became a ghost. There was no GPS to track his car, no cell phone pings to reveal his location, and no national registry of missing children that local police could easily access. The step-by-step process of Gary's disappearance was surprisingly simple by 1970s standards. He utilized the recently completed segments of the interstate highway system, paying for leaded gasoline with crumpled $5 bills. He stayed in roadside motels that only required a signature in a paper guest book. Because the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Act had not yet been adopted by all 50 states, if Gary could make it to a state that hadn't signed on, he could potentially petition a local judge for a new temporary custody order, claiming he was the primary caregiver. Historical trends indicate that by the late 1970s, an estimated 25,000 to 100,000 children were being taken by non-custodial parents every year. This wasn't a fringe occurrence, it was a national crisis. These men were not typical criminals. They were often desperate fathers who viewed themselves as liberators of their own children. They were supported by a shadowy network that functioned like an underground railroad for fathers. This network consisted of loosely organized support groups that provided tips on how to obtain a new Social Security card, how to find work under the table, and which states had the most lenient judges. The case study of the underground dad reveals a life of constant grinding paranoia. Gary ended up in a small town in Georgia, working as a mechanic under an assumed name. He told his son they were on a long camping trip. He avoided doctors, schools, and any government interaction. This is the part of the 1970s retrospective that is often omitted, the deep psychological trauma inflicted on the children who were caught in this tug-of-war. While the fathers felt they were saving their relationship with their kids, the children were living a life of secrecy, often being told their mother had died or had abandoned them to explain the sudden move. This era of snatching led to a massive shift in the American legal consciousness. By 1979, the public outcry for mothers whose children had vanished led to high-profile congressional hearings. For the first time, the federal government began to look at the domestic problem of divorce as a matter of national security. The potential outcomes of this lawlessness were the catalyst for the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act of 1980. But in the final months of 1979, the atmosphere was one of total adversarial combat. Private investigators became the millionaires of the 1970s divorce boom. A father with enough money could hire a recovery team to snatch his child back from the mother, leading to a cycle of re-snatching that could last for years. These investigators used tactics that would be highly illegal today, including wiretapping landlines, going through trash for utility bills, and using pretexting to get information from banks. For a man like Gary, the fear wasn't just the police. It was the two men in suits who might show up at his son's playground at any moment. As these desperate acts of kidnapping dominated the headlines, they perversely hurt the cause of the peaceful fathers' rights movement. Every time a father made the news for snatching a child, it reinforced the stereotype of the unstable, dangerous divorced man. The men who were trying to play by the rules, like the advocates for joint custody in California, found themselves constantly having to distance themselves from the vigilante fathers. They had to prove that they didn't want to steal their children. They just wanted to be allowed to parent them. This brings us to a critical juncture in the 1970s timeline. While the highways were filled with fathers on the run, a different kind of battle was being waged in the State House in Sacramento. A small group of men, led by James Cook, decided that the only way to stop the snatching and the visitation wars was to mandate that both parents stay in the picture. They realized that if a father felt he had a guaranteed legal right to his child, he wouldn't feel the need to become a fugitive. Imagine if you were in the room during the 1979 legislative debates. You had traditionalists who believed fathers were incapable of nurturing, and you had radical feminists who feared joint custody would be used as a tool of domestic control. Between these two poles were the 1970s dads, men who had been through the bachelor pads, the every other weekend dinners, and the heartbreak of being a visitor. They were fighting for a law that would eventually change the world, but they were doing it in the shadow of the kidnappings and the deadbeat headlines. The year 1979 was the tipping point. It was the year when the frustration of the American father finally met a legislative solution that actually had teeth. But the road to this victory was paved with the broken lives of men who felt they had no other choice but to disappear. We have to ask, was the joint custody movement a response to the kidnapping crisis? Or was it the final realization that the no-fault revolution had been incomplete? As the 1970s drew to a close, the era of the visitor dad was dying, but the era of the co-parent was being born in a crucible of conflict. In the next part, we are going to deep dive into the specific day-by-day battle for the California Joint Custody Act of 1979. We will look at the secret meetings, the unexpected allies, and the specific wording of the law that shifted the burden of proof from the father to the system. You will see how one single piece of paper in 1979 laid the groundwork for every custody battle happening in 2026. But first, we have to look at the Kramer versus Kramer effect one more time, because while the law was changing in the State House, the culture was being changed in the movie theaters, and the two were about to collide in a way no one expected. By the time Kramer versus Kramer swept the Academy Awards in early 1980, the state of California had already fired the first shot in a legislative revolution that would redefine the American family. In 1979, the cultural fascination with the sensitive, struggling father played by Dustin Hoffman was not just a cinematic trend. It was a reflection of a massive, ground-level political push. While audiences were weeping over the sight of a father making burnt French toast, a man named James Cook was walking the halls of the California state capitol with a mission that would eventually rewrite the potential outcomes for every father in the United States. Cook was not a high-priced lobbyist or a career politician. He was a father who had been through the mill of the 1970s divorce system and realized that the system was fundamentally broken because it treated children like property to be awarded rather than humans with a right to both parents. This was the year of Assembly Bill 1480. To understand the depth of this shift, we have to look at the step-by-step reality of what it took to get this bill passed. In 1979, the historical trend showed that sole custody was granted to mothers in nearly 90% of cases. The prevailing legal theory was that a child needed a single primary residence for stability. James Cook and his allies challenged this by introducing the concept of joint custody as a legal preference. This was a radical departure. It proposed that the court should favor an arrangement where both parents shared the rights and responsibilities of upbringing. Imagine if you were a legislator in 1979. You were being told that the thousands of years of patriarchal and then matriarchal custody traditions should be scrapped in favor of a 50-50 split. The opposition was fierce and multifaceted. On one side, you had segments of the legal community who were concerned that joint custody would lead to more litigation, as parents would constantly be back in court over every minor decision. On the other side, some advocacy groups feared that joint custody would be used as a tool by disgruntled men to maintain psychological control over their ex-wives, or to avoid paying appropriate child support. But Cook's strategy was brilliant. He framed joint custody not as a father's right, but as a child's right to have frequent and continuing contact with both parents. This phrase, frequent and continuing contact, became the cornerstone of the bill and, eventually, the cornerstone of family law across the entire country. Let us look at a case study of a father we will call Steve, an architect living in San Diego in 1979. Steve was among the first wave of men to try to utilize the new language of AB 1480, even before it was fully enacted. Imagine if you were Steve. You had been living in a small studio apartment for 2 years, seeing your daughter every other weekend. You were paying child support that consumed 40% of your take-home pay, leaving you with barely enough to cover your own rent and groceries. When you heard about the joint custody bill, it felt like a lifeline. But the process was not as simple as signing a new piece of paper. Steve had to go before a judge who had spent 20 years reflexively awarding sole custody to mothers. The step-by-step battle for Steve involved proving a negative. He didn't just have to prove he was a good father. He had to prove that his daughter's life would not be irreparably harmed by spending 3 nights a week at his apartment. In 1979, there was very little data to support him. Looking back from 2026, we have decades of sociological research showing that children in shared parenting arrangements generally have better emotional and academic outcomes. But for Steve in 1979, all he had was his own determination and the burgeoning father's rights movement. He had to show the court that he had a bedroom for his daughter, that he knew the name of her pediatrician, and that he was capable of managing her school schedule. These were things that, in the 1970s, many judges simply did not believe a man could or would do. The passing of AB 1480 in 1979, signed into law by Governor Jerry Brown, was the first time a state had officially declared that joint custody was in the best interest of the child. This was a seismic shift in potential outcomes. It moved the burden of proof. Previously, a father had to prove why he should be involved. Now, in California at least, the system was starting to ask why he shouldn't be. This legislative victory in the final months of the decade served as the closing chapter to the Me decade and the opening chapter of the co-parenting era. However, the reality of 1979 was also shadowed by the economic malaise of the time. While the law was changing, the economy was cratering. Inflation hit 13% that year. For a divorced father, the cost of maintaining a household that was custody-ready became an almost insurmountable hurdle. This created a class divide in fatherhood that we are still analyzing in 2026. If you were a wealthy father like the character in Kramer versus Kramer, you could afford the legal fees and the multi-bedroom apartment to win your case. But if you were a blue-collar father, the new joint custody laws often felt like a hollow victory, because you couldn't afford the physical space required to exercise those rights. This era also saw the rise of a new type of professional, the custody evaluator. As judges became overwhelmed by the new joint custody mandates, they began delegating their decision-making to psychologists and social workers. This added a new, expensive step-by-step layer to the divorce process. A father now had to be interviewed, tested, and observed by a stranger who would then write a report determining his fate. Case studies from 1979 show that these evaluators often held their own deep-seated biases about gender roles, frequently penalizing fathers who worked long hours or who didn't fit a specific soft-spoken archetype of 1970s sensitivity. Imagine the tension in a 1979 courtroom. You have the old guard judges, the new guard psychologists, the desperate fathers, and the wary mothers, all colliding in a system that was essentially being built while they were standing in it. The 1970s ended not with a resolution, but with a total reconfiguration of the battlefield. The visitor dad was technically a thing of the past in the eyes of the law, but the equal dad was still a work in progress. As we move out of 1979 and into the 1980s, the focus began to shift from the right to see the child to the financial cost of that right. The custody wars of the 70s were about to transform into the child support wars of the 80s. The legislative victory in California had given fathers a foot in the door, but it had also opened a Pandora's box of financial obligations and state interventions. The 1970s father had fought for the right to be a parent, but he was about to find out that the government was going to make him pay for that right in ways he never imagined. The decade ended with a sense of cautious optimism for men like Steve and James Cook, but a new, much more aggressive system of federal oversight was looming on the horizon. In the next part, we are going to look at the immediate aftermath of the 1979 Joint Custody Act, and how it triggered a nationwide domino effect. We will examine the birth of the federal child support enforcement system and the taxing of fatherhood. We will see how the 1980s took the emotional victories of the 70s and turned them into a cold, hard spreadsheet of dollars and cents. The battle for the heart was over. The battle for the wallet was just beginning. Stay tuned, because the transition into the Reagan era would bring a whole new set of historical trends that would catch the American father completely off guard. The transition from the late 1970s into the early 1980s marked a pivot from the sociological struggle of fatherhood to the cold, administrative reality of state-mandated financial obligation. While the California Joint Custody Act of 1979 felt like a sunrise for fathers seeking time, a different storm was gathering in the halls of the federal government. To understand the American father in 1980, you have to understand Title 4D of the Social Security Act. Although passed in 1975, its gears truly began to grind with terrifying efficiency as the decade turned. This was the birth of the modern child support enforcement machine, and for the 1970s dad, it changed the stakes from a private family matter to a federal interest. Imagine if you were Mark, a 36-year-old supervisor at a textile mill in North Carolina in 1980. Mark had finally secured a joint custody arrangement after a 3-year legal battle that had drained his modest savings. He felt he had reached a plateau of stability. Then he received a letter from a state agency he had never heard of, the Office of Child Support Enforcement. Under the new historical trends of the era, the state was no longer just a neutral arbiter of divorce. It was now a debt collector. Because Mark's ex-wife had briefly applied for state medical assistance during their separation, the state now had a vested interest in recouping those costs directly from Mark's paycheck. The step-by-step process of this enforcement was a shock to the system of the 1980s father. In 1926, fatherhood was defined by presence. In 2026, we see it as a complex web of emotional and financial roles. But in 1980, the government began to narrow that definition down to a single number on a ledger. Mark's first encounter with the 4D system involved a mandatory meeting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit government office. There was no discussion of his joint custody schedule, or the fact that he bought all the children's school clothes. The agency used a primitive version of what we now call child support guidelines. At the time, these guidelines were often arbitrary, varying wildly from one county to the next, and they rarely accounted for the actual cost of living in a period of 14% inflation. Historical trends show that the early 1980s were a period of intense economic volatility. For a father like Mark, The potential outcomes of a support order were often mathematically impossible. If Mark earned $1,000 a month, the court might order $400 in support. After federal and state taxes, and the skyrocketing cost of gasoline and heating oil, Mark was left with less than $300 to cover his own rent and the food for his children during his custodial time. This created the 1980s pressure cooker, a generation of men who were legally empowered to be fathers, but financially strangled by the state's efforts to balance its own welfare books. This was the era when the term deadbeat dad began to be weaponized in the national media. It is a case study in how public policy can shift public perception. The 1980 presidential election of Ronald Reagan brought a new focus on fiscal responsibility and the reduction of the welfare state. The narrative was simple: if fathers paid more, the state would pay less. While this was logically sound in cases of true abandonment, the broad brush application of the policy caught millions of involved, struggling fathers in its net. In 1981, the federal government authorized the Internal Revenue Service to intercept tax refunds of parents who were behind on support. Imagine the shock of a father expecting a $500 refund to pay for a car repair, only to receive a letter stating the money had been seized by the state without a hearing. The administrative growth of these agencies was astronomical. Between 1978 and 1982, the number of child support cases handled by state agencies nearly doubled. This led to a step-by-step breakdown in due process. Because the systems were not yet computerized in any meaningful way, mistakes were rampant. Case studies from this period are filled with stories of men who had paid their support directly to the mother, only to have the state claim they owed thousands in back payments because there was no official record in the agency's ledger. A father would have to produce physical, canceled checks from 3 years prior to prove his innocence, often while facing the threat of jail time for contempt of court. This created a massive psychological rift. On one hand, the 1970s had told men like Mark that they should be sensitive, involved, and present. Movies like Kramer vs. Kramer had validated their emotional importance. On the other hand, the 1980s legal system was telling them they were primarily a source of revenue. If the money didn't arrive, the presence didn't matter. This led to a resurgence of the very thing the 1979 joint custody laws were meant to prevent: the disappearing father. Many men, overwhelmed by the debt and the adversarial nature of the enforcement agencies, simply gave up. They moved, they took jobs that paid in cash, and they faded out of their children's lives, not out of a lack of love, but out of a sense of total defeat by a machine they couldn't fight. Let us look at the imagine-if scenario of the 1982 wage garnishment. Today, in 2026, payroll deductions are automated and common, but in 1982, having your wages garnished was a mark of deep social shame. When a garnishment order arrived at Mark's textile mill, it didn't just go to a nameless payroll department. It went to his boss, a man who had known Mark's father. The social stigma of being labeled a man who doesn't provide for his kids was a powerful tool of the state, often used to coerce men into signing agreements they couldn't possibly fulfill. The data from the early 80s shows that the potential outcomes of these aggressive enforcement tactics were mixed. While the state did succeed in recouping millions in welfare costs, the social cost was a generation of high-conflict parentage. The courtroom became a place where mothers and fathers were forced to fight over every dollar, because the stakes were so high for both sides. Mothers were often told that if they didn't cooperate with the state's aggressive pursuit of the father, their own benefits would be cut. This forced parents who might have otherwise co-parented peacefully into a state of perpetual legal warfare. As we move deeper into the 1980s, we see the emergence of the first national databases for tracking parents. The Federal Parent Locator Service began using Social Security numbers to find men who had moved across state lines. The 1970s era of the underground dad was effectively over. There was nowhere left to hide. But as the state got better at finding fathers, it didn't necessarily get better at supporting fatherhood. The machine was designed to collect money, not to foster relationships. This brings us to a crucial realization for our retrospective. The 1970s gave fathers the right to be in the room, but the early 1980s determined the price of the ticket. The transition was brutal, efficient, and deeply impersonal. The American father was no longer a visitor, but he was becoming a debtor to the state. But as the mid-80s approached, a new movement began to form among the men who had stayed. They realized that if they were going to be held to such high financial standards, they had to demand even higher standards for their parental rights. They began to question why the state was so efficient at collecting money, but so remarkably slow at enforcing visitation and custody orders. In the next part, we are going to look at the Great Enforcement Gap of 1984. We will examine why the law became a one-way street, where a father could be jailed for missing a payment, but a mother faced zero consequences for moving a child away or blocking a scheduled visit. We will look at the case studies of the men who decided to sue the state for equal protection under the law, and how this led to the next great evolution in the American family court system. The battle for the wallet was about to turn back into a battle for justice, and the stakes were higher than ever. Stay tuned because the mid-80s were about to prove that a father's love was more than just a line item on a government spreadsheet. To understand the sheer frustration of the mid-1980s American father, you have to look at the legislative double standard that became the law of the land in 1984. This was the year of the Child Support Enforcement Amendments, a federal mandate that effectively turned the screws on the financial obligations of the American father, while leaving his parental rights in a state of legal purgatory. While the 1970s had been about the fight for the right to be in the room, the mid-80s became a masterclass in the asymmetry of power. The state had perfected the art of the collection, but it had completely ignored the art of the connection. Imagine if you were Kevin, a 40-year-old mid-level manager at an insurance firm in suburban Connecticut in 1984. Kevin was the quintessential 1970s success story turned 1980s statistic. He had successfully navigated a no-fault divorce in 1978, and had managed to maintain a relatively stable relationship with his two young daughters. He was part of the first generation of men who actually wanted to be at every school play and every soccer game. But in 1984, the ground shifted. Under the new federal amendments, Kevin's child support was no longer a check he wrote and mailed with a letter to his kids. It was now an automatic deduction from his paycheck, a process known as immediate income withholding. The step-by-step reality of this change for Kevin was a profound loss of agency. In the early 80s, the act of paying support was often a father's last remaining tether to the household he had helped build. By automating this process, the state removed the personal element and replaced it with an industrial one. Historical trends show that while this significantly increased the reliability of payments for custodial mothers, it also deepened the psychological alienation of the father. For Kevin, seeing that line item on his pay stub every 2 weeks was a constant sterile reminder that the state viewed him primarily as a financial resource, not a human being. However, the real sting for fathers like Kevin was the enforcement gap. Imagine if your ex-spouse decided, for no legal reason, to cancel your scheduled weekend. You show up at the door and no one is home. You call the house and the line is busy. This is where the 1980s legal system revealed its true colors. When Kevin went to the local police to report a violation of his court-ordered visitation, he was met with the same shrug that fathers had received for decades. The police would tell him it was a civil matter, and that they could not force a mother to give up her children. This created a one-way street of family law. If Kevin missed a child support payment, the potential outcomes were swift and severe. Under the 1984 amendments, the state could seize his tax refunds, report his delinquency to credit bureaus, and even revoke his professional licenses. The federal government had created a high-speed highway for the collection of money, but when it came to the enforcement of visitation, fathers were still stuck on a dirt road. Case studies from 1985 show that for every $100 collected by the state, virtually $0 were spent on ensuring that the fathers who paid that money actually got to see their children. This imbalance gave rise to the payer versus parent identity crisis. Kevin began to feel like a visitor in his own life. The historical trends of this period show a spike in what sociologists called the parental alienation syndrome, a term coined by Richard Gardner in 1985. While controversial, the term captured the lived experience of millions of men who felt that their relationship with their children was being systematically eroded by a custodial parent who held all the legal cards. In Kevin's case, he began to notice his daughters becoming distant. They started repeating phrases they had clearly heard from their mother, phrases about how dad didn't want to pay for their new clothes or how dad was choosing to live in a different town. The data from the mid-80s reveals a heartbreaking correlation. As the state became more aggressive in its financial pursuit of fathers, the emotional involvement of those fathers often began to wane. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was a defense mechanism against the constant pain of being a second-class parent. When you are treated like a debtor rather than a father, you eventually start to act like one. This was the great disconnect of the 1980s. The government was solving the problem of the deadbeat dad on paper, but it was inadvertently creating a generation of displaced dads in reality. To combat this, the Fathers' Rights movement in 1986 began to shift its strategy. They realized that protesting at the State House wasn't enough. They had to go after the very concept of the best interests of the child. They argued that it was fundamentally impossible for a child's best interest to be served by a system that enforced the money but not the love. They began to file lawsuits based on the 14th Amendment, claiming that their right to due process and equal protection was being violated. If the state was going to use its police power to take their money, it had to use its police power to protect their relationship. Let us look at a case study of a father in Texas named David. David was an engineer who spent 3 years and over $50,000 in legal fees just to get the court to enforce a visitation schedule that he was already paying for. David's story became a rallying cry for the mid-80s movement. It highlighted the litigation tax on fatherhood. If a father wanted to see his children, he had to be wealthy enough to keep suing for his rights. If he was a blue-collar worker like many of the men in the 70s retrospective, he was simply priced out of his own family. Looking back from 2026, we see this period as the moment when the industrialization of divorce truly took hold. The courtrooms of 1987 were no longer places of quiet deliberation, they were assembly lines. Judges were under immense pressure to clear backlogs, and since child support was now governed by rigid federal formulas, they spent almost no time on the nuances of the father-child bond. The 1970s sensitive dad had been replaced by the 1980s data point. But even in this cold administrative environment, the resilience of the American father was beginning to manifest in new ways. Men were starting to form their own support networks that went beyond legal advice. They were sharing tips on how to stay connected through letters, how to record their voices on cassette tapes for their kids to hear, and how to navigate the step-parent minefield that was becoming increasingly common as the 1970s divorcees began to remarry. The decade of the 80s was proving to be a much tougher mountain to climb than the 70s. The enemies were no longer just outdated social norms. The enemy was now a massive, self-sustaining government bureaucracy that profited from the conflict. Every time a father and mother fought in court, the system grew larger. This brings us to the final years of the 1980s, where the tension between the collection machine and the human connection would finally reach a breaking point. The American father was tired of being a line item. He was ready to demand a seat at the table that wasn't just about his bank account. In the next part, we are going to look at the 1988 Family Support Act and the rise of the friendly parent provision. We will examine how the law finally began to recognize that the custodial parent had a duty to facilitate the relationship with the father. We will dive into the landmark cases where fathers finally won the right to stop paying support if their visitation was being blocked, a move that sent shockwaves through the legal system. But as the 80s drew to a close, a new and even more complex challenge was emerging: the rise of the blended family and the struggle for the bio-dad to maintain his relevance in a world of stepfathers and new beginnings. The battle for identity was about to enter its most complicated phase yet. Stay tuned, because the transition into the 90s would change the definition of father forever. As the American legal system rolled toward the final year of the 1980s, the battle for the identity of the divorced father moved from the wallet back to the heart of the household. The 1970s had broken the nuclear family, and the early 1980s had monetized that wreckage. But the late 1980s introduced a new and perhaps even more daunting challenge: the rise of the blended family. By 1988, a massive percentage of the men who had divorced during the 1970s revolution were watching their former wives remarry. This created a social phenomenon that the courts were completely unprepared for, leading to the birth of the replacement father narrative. This was a period where the biological father had to fight not just for his rights, but for his very relevance in the face of a new custodial stepfather. To understand this struggle, we have to look at the 1988 Family Support Act. While this federal law is often remembered for making wage withholding mandatory for all child support orders, its most significant cultural impact was the pressure it put on states to create a more harmonious post-divorce environment. One of the potential outcomes of this pressure was the widespread adoption of the friendly parent provision. This was a revolutionary legal standard that essentially told parents, if you want to keep custody of your children, you must prove that you are willing to facilitate a healthy relationship with the other parent. For the 1970s dad, who had spent a decade being treated as a secondary visitor, this was the first time the law had ever put a leash on the custodial parent's power to gatekeep. Imagine if you were Brian, a 42-year-old middle manager in 1989 Pennsylvania. Brian was a veteran of the 1970s divorce wars. He had lived in the wood-paneled apartments, he had paid the skyrocketing support during the inflation of the early 80s, and he had finally settled into a stable routine with his 2 teenage sons. Then his ex-wife remarried. Suddenly, there was a new man in the house. A man who was there for the Tuesday night dinners, the Wednesday homework sessions, and the Thursday night football practices. Brian, the biological father, was suddenly relegated to the Friday night pickup. In 2026, we have complex sociological terms for this like social fathering, but in 1989, Brian just felt like he was being erased. The step-by-step process of this erasure often began with small, seemingly insignificant changes. The stepfather might start signing school permission slips. The children might start referring to the stepfather's parents as grandma and grandpa. Historical trends during this period show a massive spike in litigation where biological fathers were fighting for the right to remain the primary male influence in their children's lives. Brian's case study is a classic example of how the friendly parent doctrine was used as a shield. When his ex-wife tried to move the children to a different school district without his consent, a move supported by the new stepfather's career, Brian went to court. For the first time, he didn't just argue that the move was bad for him. He argued that his ex-wife was failing the friendly parent test by trying to diminish his role. This era marked the peak of the industrialization of divorce. The late 1980s saw the birth of court-mandated mediation. Judges were tired of the Brian versus Sarah battles that had been clogging their dockets since 1975. They began to realize that a father who feels respected and involved is a father who is more likely to pay support and less likely to engage in high-conflict behavior. This led to a historical trend where courts started ordering parents to attend co-parenting classes. Imagine the scene in 1989. 20 divorced couples sitting in a basement community center, being taught by a social worker how to talk to each other without screaming. For the 1970s dad, this was a surreal experience. He had spent years being told he didn't matter, and now the state was suddenly trying to teach him and his ex-spouse how to be teammates. The potential outcomes of these classes were often transformative, but they also highlighted the deep economic divide. A father like Brian could afford the time and the legal counsel to navigate these new requirements, but for the blue-collar father, the 1988 Family Support Act's focus on automated enforcement made the system feel more like a trap than a support network. If a father lost his job in the manufacturing downturn of the late 80s, the automated system didn't care. It kept deducting, and if the money wasn't there, it kept accruing debt with high interest rates. This created a new class of indebted fathers, who were legally encouraged to be involved via the friendly parent doctrine, but were physically and mentally broken by the financial weight of the enforcement machine. Deep dive into the data of 1989 shows that the replacement father fear was not just paranoia. Many custodial parents, seeking to create a fresh start for their new marriage, would intentionally or unintentionally alienate the biological father. They would schedule children's activities during his visitation time, or tell the children that dad is too busy to come to their events. The historical trends of the late 80s show that this led to the first major wave of enforcement of visitation lawsuits. Fathers were no longer just defending themselves against support increases. They were suing for their time. They were using the very same state machinery that collected their money to demand their hours. This period was also the dawn of the Generation X experience of divorce. The children of the 1970s were now reaching their teenage years. They were the first generation to grow up with the every other weekend lifestyle as a norm. They were the ones navigating the 2 houses, 2 sets of rules reality. Case studies from this era began to show that these children were developing a unique resilience, but also a deep skepticism of traditional family structures. The 1970s dad was now parenting teenagers who had seen the worst of their parents' conflicts, and the late 80s became a time of relational repair. Fathers like Brian were trying to rebuild bonds that had been frayed by a decade of legal warfare. As the decade drew to a close, the American father was in a state of transition. He was no longer the visitor of 1974, but he wasn't quite the equal co-parent of 2026. He was somewhere in between. A man with a legal right to be heard, a financial obligation that never slept, and a psychological battle to remain relevant in a world that was moving on without him. The 1980s ended with the realization that laws could change, and money could be collected, but the heart of fatherhood was something the state could neither mandate nor fully protect. The battle lines were being redrawn once again as the calendar turned toward the 1990s. The me decade of the 70s and the greed decade of the 80s had left the American father with a set of tools he was finally learning how to use. But a new cultural archetype was about to emerge, the new man of the 90s. This was a version of fatherhood that would demand more than just time or money. It would demand a total cultural reevaluation of what it meant to be a man in a post-nuclear world. But before we get to the sensitive 90s, we have to look at the darker side of the late 80s transition, the rise of the parental rights militancy. Some men, tired of the slow pace of the friendly parent doctrine, began to take even more radical steps. In the next part, we are going to look at the emergence of father's rights talk radio, the first major organized protests at the nation's capital, and the high-stakes cases that eventually made it to the Supreme Court. We will examine how the 1970s dad went from a lonely man in a bachelor pad to a political insurgent capable of shaking the very foundations of the American legal system. The decade was ending, but the real fight was just beginning. Stay tuned for the penultimate chapter of this deep dive. The year 1989 acted as a pressure cooker for the American father. The decade of the 1970s had introduced the shock of no-fault divorce, and the 1980s had industrialized the collection of child support. But as the calendar turned toward 1990, the isolated frustration of millions of men began to coalesce into a genuine political insurgency. This was the era of the Great Mobilization. Fathers who had spent the last 15 years navigating wood-paneled apartments and every other weekend visitation schedules were no longer content with being silent casualties of a social revolution. They began to realize that their individual struggles were part of a systemic historical trend, and for the first time, they began to use the tools of the era: broadcast media, grassroots organizing, and high-stakes litigation to fight back. Imagine if you were Jerry, a 44-year-old civil engineer in 1989 Atlanta. Jerry was a veteran of the 1970s divorce wave. He had lost his primary residence in 1976, lived through the stagflation of the late 70s while paying support, and had seen his relationship with his teenage daughter reduced to a series of awkward phone calls and expensive summer trips. For years, Jerry felt like he was the only one. He felt a deep personal shame for his visitor status. But one night, while driving home from his engineering firm, he tuned his radio to a late-night talk show. He heard a voice, another father, describing the exact same scenario: the gatekeeping, the financial strangulation, and the feeling of being a second-class citizen in the eyes of the family court. This was the birth of Father's Rights Talk Radio. Before the internet and long before the social media landscape of 2026, the AM radio waves became the town square for the displaced American father. Step by step, these men began to find each other. The process was analog but effective. A father would hear a phone number on the radio, write it down on a napkin, and call it the next day. This led to the formation of local chapters of organizations like the National Coalition of Free Men or the American Fathers Coalition. These weren't just support groups, they were becoming political action committees. Historical trends show that between 1988 and 1991, the number of registered fathers' rights organizations in the United States tripled. They began to move beyond the diner meetings and into the streets. Imagine the visual of June 1990 Father's Day. In cities like Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Chicago, hundreds of men in business suits stood on the steps of courthouses and state capitals. They weren't carrying signs about taxes or war. They were carrying photos of their children. This was a radical departure from the 1970s, where a divorced father was expected to disappear quietly into the background. The 1990 father was demanding a public accounting for the domestic policies that had defined the previous 2 decades. The potential outcomes of this mobilization began to manifest in the legal arena. These men were no longer just complaining to their buddies, they were hiring constitutional lawyers. They began to challenge the very foundation of the best interests of the child standard, arguing that it was too vague and allowed for judicial whim to supersede parental rights. They pointed to the 14th Amendment, arguing that the right to parent is a fundamental liberty that the state cannot infringe upon without a compelling reason and due process. Case studies from 1990 show a surge in civil rights lawsuits filed by fathers against state agencies, alleging that the aggressive child support enforcement measures were being applied without the same level of commitment to enforcing visitation rights. To understand the depth of this shift, look at the step-by-step evolution of the legal strategy. In 1975, a father might have pleaded for more time based on his love for his child. By 1990, a father like Jerry was walking into court with data. He was armed with psychological studies showing the long-term impact of father absence on child development. He was utilizing the parental alienation research that had gained traction in the mid-80s to show that his child's reluctance to see him wasn't natural, but coached. He was no longer a supplicant, he was a litigant. However, the transition into the 1990s also brought a new cultural archetype. the sensitive new age guy, or the snag. While the 1970s dad was trying to figure out how to be a parent, the early 90s dad was being told he had to be a partner in every sense of the word. This created a secondary friction. The legal system was still catching up to the 1979 joint custody laws, but the culture was already moving toward an expectation of total domestic equality. For the divorced father, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it validated his desire to be involved. On the other hand, it made any perceived failure, financial or emotional, seem even more egregious in the eyes of the public. Data from the 1990 census revealed that over 24% of American children were living in single-parent households, a massive increase from the early 1970s. This statistic became a national talking point. Politicians began to realize that the divorce revolution had created a massive social bill that was coming due. The fathers' rights movement tapped into this, arguing that many of the social ills being blamed on single-mother households, poverty, crime, school dropout rates, were actually the result of a legal system that had systematically removed fathers. They reframed their struggle as a solution to a national crisis. Imagine if you were Jerry in 1991, attending one of the first national conferences on fatherhood. You're in a hotel ballroom with 500 other men. For the first time, you don't feel like a failure. You feel like a pioneer. You realize that the 1970s didn't just happen to you. You were a participant in a tectonic shift in human history. The step-by-step realization for these men was that they were the bridge generation. They had one foot in the traditional patriarchal past and one foot in a future where fatherhood would have to be earned and protected through the law. The early 90s also saw the emergence of the first fathering magazines and newsletters, which provided a counter-narrative to the deadbeat dad headlines. They shared stories of men who had successfully navigated the blended family minefield, men who had won 50-50 custody, and men who were finding ways to be primary parents, despite the historical trends working against them. This was the beginning of the information age for fathers. The domestic illiteracy of the 1970s was being replaced by a highly informed, highly motivated class of men who knew their rights and were no longer afraid to exercise them. As we move toward the final chapter of this retrospective, we see that the 1970s dad had transformed. He had gone from the lonely man in the bachelor pad to the political insurgent on the courthouse steps. He had survived the economic stagflation of the 70s, the aggressive enforcement of the 80s, and the cultural erasure of the early 90s. He had paved the way for the world we live in today in 2026, where the idea of an involved, co-parenting father is not just a dream, but a standard expectation. But the story isn't over. The legacy of the 1970s is still being felt in every custody hearing, happening this very afternoon. There is one final piece of the puzzle to examine: the ultimate impact on the children of the 1970s, the Gen X kids who are now the parents and judges of today. How did their experience of the visitor dad era shape the modern family court? In the final part of this series, we are going to tie it all together. We will look at the long-term potential outcomes of the 1970s divorce revolution and where the American father stands in 2026. We will examine the final case study of legacy and provide a definitive answer to the question: was the pain of the 70s and 80s worth the progress of today? Get ready for the conclusion of our deep dive masterclass, because the final revelation will change the way you look at your own family history forever. The circle is about to be completed. The circle is about to be completed because we are finally standing at the vantage point of 2026, looking back through the smog and shag carpet of the 1970s to see the long-term potential outcomes of the greatest social experiment in American history. To understand the divorce dad of the 1970s, you have to understand the adult he produced. The children who sat in the back of those station wagons during the 1978 interstate handoffs are now the policymakers, the judges, and the fathers of today. This is the generation that took the trauma of the visitor era and transformed it into the co-parenting revolution. Let us look at a final full-circle case study of a man named Jason. In 1975, Jason was 6 years old, living in a suburb of Philadelphia. His father, a man we will call Tom, was a classic 1970s statistic. Tom was a veteran who worked in insurance, and when the no-fault divorce hit his household in 1974, he was relegated to the standard every other weekend schedule. Jason remembers the step-by-step ritual of those weekends, the silent car rides, the strange smell of his father's bachelor apartment, and the feeling that his father was a temporary guest in his life. Imagine if you were Jason in 2026. Today, Jason is 57 years old and serves as a family law mediator. His entire career is dedicated to ensuring that the mistakes of 1975 are not repeated. Jason's perspective is the ultimate data point in our retrospective. He represents the historical trends of the Gen X experience, a cohort that grew up as the first large-scale generation of children of divorce. The potential outcomes for Jason's generation were often painted as bleak by early researchers, but the reality was a radical evolution in the definition of family. In 2026, the family court system in many U.S. states has shifted toward a default presumption of 50-50 shared parenting. This was not a random occurrence. It was the direct result of the children of the 1970s reaching adulthood and saying, "Never again." They remembered the pain of the visitation schedule and used their professional lives to dismantle the tender years doctrine once and for all. When Jason sits across from a divorcing couple today, he isn't just looking at legal statutes. He is looking through the lens of that 6-year-old boy in the back of a 1975 Chevy. Historical trends show that the longitudinal studies started in the 1970s, such as the work by Judith Wallerstein and E. Mavis Hetherington, provided the raw data that fueled this change. Wallerstein's 25-year study, though controversial for its focus on the negative impacts of divorce, highlighted a crucial truth. The loss of the father-child bond was one of the most significant predictors of long-term emotional struggle. This data, which began as a trickle in 1971, became a flood by the year 2000, forcing the legal system to acknowledge that the visitor model was a failure for the child's development. The step-by-step transformation of the American father can be tracked through the evolution of his physical space. In the 1970s, we had the wood-paneled bachelor pad with the beanbag chair. By the 1990s, we had the second bedroom with a spare bed phase. In 2026, the home of a divorced father is indistinguishable from any other family home. There are toys in the living room, a chore chart on the refrigerator, and a permanent space for the children that isn't a suitcase in the corner. This physical integration reflects the psychological integration. The 1970s dad was a provider who lost his job. The 2026 dad is a parent who happens to live in a different house. This brings us to the resolution of the mystery we started with. Why does the system today feel so adversarial? It is because we are still using the infrastructure built in the 1970s to house a 2026 reality. The courtroom itself, the adversarial model where one person must win and the other must lose, was never designed for co-parenting. It was designed to divide assets and assign blame. The 1970s fathers who fought for joint custody were trying to fit a round peg of shared love into a square hole of litigation. Consider the imagine-if scenario of the modern workplace. In 1974, if a father told his boss he needed to leave at 3 p.m. to pick up his kids because it was his custodial day, he might have been fired or at least seen as uncommitted to his career. Today, in 2026, the historical trends have shifted so far that many of the largest U.S. corporations have built-in flexibility for co-parenting schedules. This cultural shift is the delayed victory of the 1970s dad. Every time a father today takes paternity leave or leaves early for a school play without shame, he is cashing a check that was signed by a man in 1978 who was laughed at for wanting to attend a PTA meeting. The data also reveals a shift in the economic potential outcomes of fatherhood. In the 1980s, we saw the rise of the child support enforcement machine. By 2026, we are seeing the rise of the equitable distribution of parenting time as a way to stabilize child support. The system is beginning to recognize that when fathers are granted equal time, the need for high-conflict financial warfare often decreases. Case studies from states like Kentucky and Arizona, which pioneered the 50-50 default, show a marked decrease in relitigation rates. This is the efficiency that the 1970s lawmakers were searching for but couldn't find because they were too focused on the money and not enough on the time. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we must acknowledge the men who didn't make it through the 1970s ringer. There is a silent part of this retrospective for the fathers who were truly erased, the ones who couldn't afford the lawyers, the ones who were blocked by state lines, and the ones who succumbed to the depression of the visitor era. Their stories are the cautionary tales that built the safeguards we have today. Their absence in the lives of their children became the catalyst for the fathers' rights movement, proving that you cannot remove a pillar of a child's life without the whole structure leaning. The 1970s was the decade of the fracture, the 1980s was the decade of the ledger, the 1990s was the decade of the voice, and the 2000s was the decade of the reform. Now, in 2026, we are in the decade of the legacy. The American divorced father is no longer an anomaly. He is a cornerstone of the modern family structure. He has moved from the outskirts of the family circle to the very center of it. So, what is the final lesson for the audience today? It is that the history of the American father is not a straight line of progress. It is a jagged, painful climb. Understanding this history solves the problem of perspective. When you feel the weight of a modern custody battle or the frustration of a child support calculation, remember that you are navigating a system that was once far more brutal. You are standing on the ground that was cleared by the men in the 1970s who had nothing but a beanbag chair and a desperate need to stay in their children's lives. This concludes our 10-part deep dive into the 1970s retrospective. We have covered the no-fault revolution, the bachelor pads, the kidnapping crises, the legislative battles, and the psychological legacy. But while the 1970s are over, the story of the American family is just entering a new phase. There is a new trend emerging on the horizon, one that involves the intersection of technology, remote work, and the decentralization of the traditional family home. In our next deep dive series, we are going to explore the rise of the digital nomad father and the future of long-distance co-parenting in the 2030s. How will the lessons of the 1970s apply to a world where parents live in different countries but are connected by virtual reality? How will the definition of presence change when the physical room is no longer the only room? Stay tuned, because the evolution of fatherhood is far from finished.